Hello everyone, Dr. Michael Lamas here for Teaching Subjects, and today we are going to explore some of the most frequent errors people make with verbs and more importantly how to avoid them. Now, verbs are the heart of every sentence. They give life to our words, allowing us to express actions, states, and ideas. However, they are also one of the trickiest parts of English grammar to master. And that's why this presentation is designed to help you identify and correct these common mistakes. So whether you are preparing for the IELTS, working on your academic writing, or simply aiming to improve your everyday communication skills, this guide is for you. So by the end of this session, you'll have the tools and understanding to use verbs with great accuracy and confidence. So with that, let's get started. So first, let's begin by answering an important question. Why do people struggle with verbs? So first, we need to understand the importance of verbs in communication. Verbs are the action words of a sentence. They tell us what is happening, when it's happening, and sometimes even how or why it's happening. Without verbs, it's impossible to form a complete sentence or convey meaning effectively. So for example, in the sentence, she is studying for her exams. The verb is studying tells us both the action and the time frame. Verbs are truly essential to clear and precise communication. Despite their importance, verbs can be tricky, and there are three main reasons why people often struggle with them. The first one is irregular forms. Now, English is full of verbs that don't follow the standard patterns. So for instance, most regular verbs simply add ed in the past tense, like the word walk becomes walked, but irregular verbs break the rules, right? So the word go becomes went, and the word eat becomes ate. It's no wonder why learners find this confusing, right? And the second reason is tense confusion. English has many tenses, each serving a specific purpose. Mistakes often happen when learners mix these tenses or use them inconsistently, such as saying, yesterday I go to the store, right? This sentence mixes past and present in a way that doesn't work. And the third one is idiomatic usage. English is filled with phrases and expressions that don't follow the usual rules, like phrasal verbs. So for example, give up does not mean give or up individually. It means to stop trying. And these idiomatic expressions often leave learners scratching their heads. But here's the good news. Mastering verbs doesn't just improve your grammar, it transforms your overall language proficiency. So when you understand how verbs work, your sentences become clearer, more accurate, and more natural. Now, this improvement builds your confidence and makes you a more effective communicator, whether you're writing, speaking, or taking exams like the IELTS. Now that we know why verbs can be challenging, let's dive into the most common mistakes that people make, and more importantly, how to avoid them. Okay, so now let's dive into the first and one of the most common mistakes people make with verbs, and this is the subject-verb agreement errors. Now, in English, the verb must agree with the subject in number. This means that if the subject is singular, the verb should also be singular. If the subject is plural, the verb must be plural. Although this might sound simple, it's an area where many learners struggle. So, let's look at an example. He go to school. Here the subject he is singular, but the verb go is in its plural form. The correct sentence should be he goes to school. That small es at the end makes all the difference in ensuring agreement. So why does this happen? Now, one common issue is that learners don't always identify whether the subject is singular or plural. For instance, let's consider this sentence. The dogs barks. Here, the dogs is plural, but the verb barks is singular. This mismatch creates an error. The correct sentence should be the dogs bark. So, how do we avoid these mistakes? So, here are two tips. The first one is to identify the subject. Before deciding on the verb form, take a moment to figure out whether the subject is singular or plural. For example, in the sentence, the boy walks, it's clear that the boy is singular, so we use the singular verb walks. The second tip is use the correct verb form. This often requires paying attention to the ending of a verb, especially in the present tense. Singular subjects usually take a verb ending in s or es in English, while plural subjects do not. Okay, now let's move on to the second common mistake, which is incorrect verb tenses. Now, tense errors occur when the verb in a sentence does not align properly, either with each other or with the intended time frame. So, for example, you might hear someone say, I was cooking and I eat it, right? This sentence mixes the past tense was cooking with the present tense eat. It's confusing because it's unclear when the actions took place, right? So the correct version should be, I was cooking and I ate it. Now, one of the most common errors learners make is inconsistent tense usage. Now, this happens when different tenses are combined inappropriately, making the sentence unclear or grammatically incorrect. Okay, so another example is, he is went to the store. So here the present tense is does not align with the past tense went. The correct sentence should be, he went to the store. Okay, so how can you avoid these errors? So here's two essential tips to remember. The first one is maintain consistency within a sentence. If you start describing an action in the past, ensure all verbs in the sentence match that time frame unless there's a specific reason to shift tenses. All right, so for example, she studies yesterday. Okay, that's the incorrect way to say it. The correct way to say is she studied yesterday. The second tip is learn the function of each tense. Okay, so each tense serves a specific purpose. So for example, the present tense is used for actions happening now, while the past tense describes completed actions. Understanding these purposes helps you choose the correct tense in your sentence. So let's practice another example. I am walking to the park yesterday. Okay, that's the incorrect way of saying it. The correct way of saying it is I walked to the park yesterday. Okay, so by consistently practicing and reviewing the rules of verb tenses, you'll be able to communicate more clearly and more accurately. Okay, so now let's address another common challenge, which is confusion between regular and irregular verbs. So in English, verbs can be divided into two categories. You have regular and irregular. Now, regular verbs follow predictable patterns, making them relatively easy to learn. So, for instance, to form the past tense, you simply add ed to the base form, like walk becomes walked. However, irregular verbs are different. They don't follow these standard rules, and this is where learners often struggle. So a common mistake is applying regular verb rules to irregular verbs. So, for example, someone might say, she goed to the store. This is incorrect because the verb go is irregular and its past tense form is went. So the correct sentence would be, she went to the store. And here's another example. She buyed a new car, right? That's the incorrect way of saying it. The correct way is, she bought a new car. Okay, so how can you avoid making these errors? So here's two practical tips for this section. The first one is memorize common irregular verbs. Now, while it might seem daunting, focusing on the most frequently used irregular verbs is a great place to start. Okay, verbs like go, eat, buy, see appear often in everyday language, so learning their forms will significantly improve your accuracy when you're speaking and when you're writing. So the second tip is practice frequently used irregular verbs in context. Okay, so for example, instead of just memorizing the forms buy, bought, try using them in a sentence, right? I buy groceries every week. Yesterday, I bought some apples. I've already bought everything I needed. Okay, so this contextual practice helps solidify your understanding and recall. So again, just keep practicing regularly. That way you start feeling more comfortable recognizing and using irregular forms correctly. Okay, so now let's move on to a more stylistic mistake that can affect clarity and readability, and that's overusing the passive voice. So in English, sentences can be written in either the active or passive voice. The active voice is direct and concise with the subject performing the action. Okay, so for example, he ate the cake. Here it's clear that he is the subject and the action is eating the cake. In contrast, the passive voice shifts the focus to the object receiving the action. Okay, so for example, the cake was eaten by him. Now, while this sentence is grammatically correct, it's less direct and can feel wordy. So overusing the passive voice is a common mistake, particularly for non-native speakers. It can make sentences unnecessarily complicated and harder to understand. So, For example, a sentence like "the report was written by the team" could be more effectively stated as "the team wrote the report." So how can you avoid this mistake? So here are two essential tips that you can use. The first one is use an active voice for clarity and impact, okay? In most cases, the active voice is the better choice because it clearly identifies who is doing what. So for example, in the sentence, "the project was completed by Sarah," that's the passive voice, which could be rewritten in the active voice, which is "Sarah completed the project." Now, the active version is shorter and more direct, making it easier to understand. The second tip is reserve passive voice for specific purposes. The passive voice can be useful in certain contexts, such as scientific writing or whether the doer of the action is unknown or unimportant. So, for example, "the experiment was conducted in a controlled environment." Here, the focus is on the experiment itself, not who conducted the experiment. Okay, so let's practice a quick correction. This is the passive voice now. So in this sentence, "the book was read by the children." The book was read by the children. Now this is the passive voice. This can be corrected in the active voice saying, "the children read the book." The children read the book. So by being mindful of when and how to use the passive voice, you can create sentences that are clear, concise, and also impactful. So our next topic is one that often confuses learners, which is gerunds and infinitives. In English, verbs are sometimes followed by other verb forms, and these are either gerunds, which end in ing form of a verb like swimming, or they can be infinitives, the to form of a verb like to swim. The challenge comes from knowing which verb requires a gerund and which requires an infinitive. So a common mistake is using the wrong form. So for example, "I enjoy to swim," right? So this is the incorrect because the verb enjoy must be followed by a gerund, not an infinitive. The correct sentence is "I enjoy swimming." Here's another example. "She suggested to go early." She suggested to go early. That's the incorrect way of saying it. The correct way is "she suggested going early." Okay, so how can you avoid these errors? So let's go over two key strategies to remember. So the first one is learn which verbs take gerund or infinitives. So some verbs are always followed by a gerund like enjoy, suggest, or avoid. Others require an infinitive like want, plan, or decide. Okay, so for example, "I want to learn English." That's an infinitive. "He avoided making a mistake," a gerund. Okay, so unfortunately, there's no shortcut. You'll just need to memorize these patterns over time. This is similar to irregular verbs. Okay, and then the next strategy is to practice with common verb patterns, right? Repetition is key, so try forming sentences with verbs that frequently appear with gerunds or infinitives. So for instance, practice saying "she enjoys reading books," or "they decided to leave early," right? So let's look at another quick correction. So here's the incorrect sentence. "I hope going on a trip soon," right? "I hope going on a trip soon." That's an incorrect way of saying it. The correct way is "I hope to go on a trip soon," right? So by paying attention to verb patterns and practicing regularly, you'll find it easier to use gerunds and infinitives correctly. Okay, so now let's discuss another common area of confusion, which is misusing modal verbs. Now, modal verbs such as can, must, should, might, and could are used to express possibility, necessity, ability, or permission. Right? So, however, they follow more specific grammatical rules, and mistakes often happen when these rules are ignored. So, one frequent error is using the wrong verb form after a modal verb, right? So remember that modals are always followed by the base form of the verb, not a conjugate or past tense form. So for example, "he musted go," right? "He musted go." That's the incorrect way of saying it. The correct way of saying it is "he must go." Okay, so here's another example. "You should to study more." "You should to study more." That is the incorrect way of saying it. Instead, it's just "you should study more." Okay, so how can you avoid missteps with modal verbs? So here's two tips for you to remember. The first one is to use the base form of the verb after a modal. The verb that follows a modal should always remain in its simplest form. So, for instance, she can drive. Another sentence, they might attend the meeting, right? So, no addition endings such as ed or ing are needed after the modal. Now, the second tip is understanding the function of each modal. Now, modals convey specific meanings, so it's important to choose the right one for the context. Okay, so for example, can indicates ability. Okay, so for example, I can swim. That indicates ability, can, right? This person can swim. The modal must shows necessity, right? You must wear a helmet. You have to wear a helmet. Then the other one is might, right? Might expresses possibility. We might go to the beach. Okay, we might go to the beach. So let's practice a sentence, right? He may to call later. He may to call later. That's the incorrect way of saying it. The correct way is he may call later. Okay, so by mastering these simple rules, you'll make your sentences more accurate and convey your ideas more effectively. As we near the end of this presentation, let's talk about practical strategies for avoiding verb mistakes. So mastering verb usage is a process that takes time, but with consistent effort, you'll see significant improvements. So here's 3 effective strategies to help you avoid common verb mistakes. So the first strategy is practice regularly, right? So the more you use verbs correctly, the more natural it will feel. Now, one simple yet powerful practice is writing sentences using different tenses. So, for example, write one sentence in the present tense, such as, I walk to school every day. Then rewrite it in the past tense, I walked to school yesterday. And then finally, use the future tense, I will walk to school tomorrow. So this exercise reinforces the rules of tense consistency and improves your overall confidence in verb usage. The second strategy is read and listen to English content. Immersion is one of the best ways to learn. Read books, articles, or blogs in English to see how verbs are used in context. Pay attention to how different tenses and verbs form appear in real sentences. Listening to podcasts, audiobooks, and conversations in English is equally helpful. So, for example, notice how modal verbs like should or can are naturally used in speech, right? You should, for example, these sentences, you should try this restaurant, or can you help me with this task, right? So observing verbs in context strengthens your understanding of how they function. The third strategy is use grammar check tools. Technology can be your best friend when learning English. Tools like Grammarly or Microsoft Word's Grammar Check provide immediate feedback. They can highlight mistakes like incorrect verb forms or subject-verb mismatches and suggest corrections. So for example, if you write, he go to the market, the tool might suggest he goes to the market. Now, regularly using these tools will help you spot patterns in your errors and avoid repeating them in the future. So let's quickly recap the key points we have covered today to reinforce your learning. We talked about subject-verb agreement errors, right? We discussed how to avoid mismatches between singular and plural subjects and verbs. Remember, this subject determines the verb form. Incorrect verb tenses. We explored how mixing tenses can confuse your message and how to keep your verb tenses consistent throughout sentences. Confusion between regular and irregular verbs. We saw that irregular verbs don't follow the regular ed pattern, so they need to be memorized. Overusing passive voice. We highlighted the importance of choosing the active voice for clarity and impact and using the passive voice only when needed. Gerunds and infinitives. We examine how to use the correct form after certain verbs, whether it's a gerund or infinitive. Misusing modal verbs. We address common mistakes like using incorrect verb forms after modal verbs and the proper usage of modals for necessity, possibility, and permission. So the key takeaway here is that continuous learning and practice are essential to mastering verb usage. The more you practice, the more confident you'll feel in applying these rules. So before we conclude, if you found this presentation helpful, please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more English learning tips. And don't forget to follow us on social media for updates and additional resources. Thank you once again for watching, keep practicing, and take your verb skills to the next level. Thanks.